If you don't know who I am, which is quite possible, I'm Joan Fickey. I'm the interim provost and senior vice president for academic affairs. Where's Romy? There he is. So Romy came in and he said, "Thank you, Joan, for continuing this series." Well, I didn't start it, but I'm smart enough to know that the heart and soul of any academic institution are the tenured faculty. And I have found every one of these lunchtime lectures to be outstanding. So there, Romy. This was an easy call. This was a very easy call. So I'm delighted to really be able to host it and write a check that I didn't commit to early on. So enjoy the lunch, please, by all means. It is a spectacular occasion. I do find these to be not only instructive, but heartwarming, because it really delivers the essence of what San Jose State University is all about. So I don't want to linger too long with the microphone so you can hear our guest speaker today, and that's Professor Jennifer Rycenga. Did I say it correctly? Okay. This introduction should really be about her, but I need to give you some context. One time long ago in my administrative career, I was the director of the Women's Center at Montclair State University. I've had a number of administrative positions, but I must tell you that was probably the favorite position that I've ever had. It was the perfect conflation of my disciplinary interests, which are women's health issues, and I taught that for many, many years. It was an administrative challenge, which I've always enjoyed, and it was the possibility for me to express my own personal values about women, women's challenges, and feminism. It was an ideal position, coupled with the fact that this was an administrative position in the Division of Student Affairs, but we collaborated very actively and profoundly with the Women's Studies program. And I got to know, even though I knew many of them from other venues, but I got to know really more deeply the Women's Studies faculty and the significance of the work that they were involved with. And I suspect that's pretty much what we're going to hear today. So without further ado, I would like to tell you a little bit about Professor Rycenga. She's a professor of Comparative and Religious Studies in the Humanities department here at San Jose State University. I see that her dean is here. There are several deans in the back. I don't know why, but they're here. Professor Rycenga's areas of interest include abolition history, women's religious history, feminist theories of music, and theoretical issues concerning philosophies of immanence and pantheism. Heavy-duty stuff, right? On the other hand, and most importantly, the significance of this work for our purposes in this day and age couldn't be more profound. There's a very long description of her work, but rather than me be the one to tell you about it, I think we should hear from the professor herself. So, Professor Rycenga.
So thank you very much to Provost Fickey, and also to Leslie Sechrist, who did a lot of the work to make this talk possible, and to everyone at the library and from the Provost office for coordinating the event. And I would also like to thank the College of Humanities and Arts and my home department of the Humanities for consistent support in the form of grants and release time and sabbatical over the years that I've been working on this project. So thank you for that. And there is an aspect of this project which I will not get to speak about today, which is the element of Native American heritage involved. Many of the Black students were actually of mixed racial heritage and had Native American connections as well. This was very common in the Free Black North in the antebellum period. So I would like to thank the people whose land we are on now, the Ohlone. And I would finally like to thank the very brave and wonderful people about whom I'm going to speak today for their bold actions 180 years ago, and in the hopes that some of you can take heart from the story I'm going to tell and bring their actions forward. Every time I get to teach here at San Jose State and I get to look out at our amazing multicultural classroom that is diverse along every single axis, whether that be racially, in terms of ethnicity, in terms of language, in terms of immigrant status, in terms of gender identification, sexuality, I think about these stories that I know from the early 19th century when at one point in Canaan, New Hampshire, an entire school building was wrested from its foundations and dumped into a river by a group of oxen led by some white supremacists because they didn't like the fact that black and white people were studying together. Apparently this was taken into consideration in the San Jose State buildings, none of which could be dragged off of their foundations. But these are our brave forebears who really have made our present day reality possible. So my talk today is on intersectional pilgrims in Canterbury, and this is the story of America's first female academy for black women. It is usually identified with the white woman whose picture was up here before, Prudence Crandall, who was the principal teacher. But I want to tell the story in a way that's going to highlight African-American agency and look in particular at how it was black women and even young black women who were shaping the agenda that made this school possible. And it is important to do that because these women went on to have a tremendous influence in antebellum free black America, which was always trying to end both slavery and racism. And they understood that racism was not going to disappear when slavery did. And so they always saw that these two things had to go together. And the quick version of the story is this. Prudence Crandall was a white woman born in Rhode Island, but grew up in Connecticut in a little town called Canterbury, which has led to countless numbers of Chaucerian references in relation to this story. But she grew up in Canterbury, and her parents had both converted to being Quakers. And the Quakers, of course, have a proud legacy of egalitarianism, at least in the abstract. Didn't always become reality, but they were often fighting for equal rights, especially for women's ability to be educated and to speak, including in the meeting house. And so it was fortunate for Crandall that she grew up as a Quaker, attended a very fine Quaker school in Rhode Island, which is now known as the Moses Brown School. It was roughly the equivalent of, say, an AP high school or a good junior college would be nowadays. But the man who was running it, Moses Brown, was also a man who had broken with his own family and his past to become an anti-slavery advocate. His brother was one of the leading slave traders in the North at the time of the American Revolution, and Moses Brown publicly broke from his brother, joined the Quakers, and became one of the first major anti-slavery activists. So he was about 80 years old at the time, but lived on the school grounds, so Crandall might have gotten to meet him and talk to him about his perspective. When she returned from her schooling, she was getting up there in years for a woman at that time. She was approaching 30 with no marriage offers, but she did have a skill now, which was to be a teacher. And the select men, as they called themselves, of Canterbury, the political force there, hired her to open a female academy. These had been popularized by Catherine Beecher, the sister of Harriet Beecher Stowe. And the idea of the female academies was to give women a taste of higher education to prepare them for teaching more and more and more. It was never to rise out of the teaching profession, but it was certainly to prepare women for the eventuality that they would have to earn their own living, which in an age of less predictable mortality than we have now, happened quite a lot. So it was under the auspices of the white men in the town that she opened her school. And then in 1832, a black woman in the town, Sarah Harris, who had gone to the elementary common schools, as they were called, along with many of Canterbury's white students, this woman, Sarah Harris, asked if she could become a student, at least a day student, at Crandall's academy. Crandall thought about it. She went to the Bible, and in what I think was a rather ill-fated move, opened to Ecclesiastes, which has to be the most depressing book in the whole Bible. But she managed to happen upon chapter 4, verse 1, which says that the oppressed had no one to stand with them. So she took this as a sign that God was directing her to admit Sarah Harris, which she did. The white parents then had what we technically call a conniption fit, and threatened to withdraw their daughters from the school unless Crandall would give up this crazy idea that a finishing school, an academy, could become a social experiment. But Crandall felt that she had indeed pledged to Sarah Harris that she would let her in. And so she said, I'm not going to go back on that decision. A group of men, white men in the town, came to visit her, and they indicated that she should give up this crazy idea, and that if, in fact, black students were allowed, the next thing you know is there would be interracial marriage. To which Crandall said, well, in the Bible, Moses has a black wife. And at this point, the select men of Canterbury said, this woman is clearly out of control, we can't reason with her. And so they left and tried to use that against her. And by the way, she was technically correct. Moses' second wife is described as a black African. So that is the story as usually told, that she then reopened the school in April of 1833 for black women only, but that the school only lasted until September of 1834, so about a year and a half. The school is often described as a failed experiment, and I'm here to tell you that that story is incorrect. The place where she taught still exists. It is the Prudence Crandall Museum, and it is located in Canterbury right at the intersection of two state highways that were state highways at that time too. It could not be a more prominent house. For those of you who know your New England history, it is right across the street from the Congregational Church, which basically means the power structure of the small New England villages. And this heroic narrative of Prudence Crandall being the one lone white woman who will stand against all of these forces, it is heroic, and indeed people have been tempted to make it into a TV miniseries and things like that, and all of those have failed miserably. But that story stays too much on the surface. And it reinscribes the old tropes of white heroism, you know, what I call the avatar problem, which is, by the way, a double problem because they also appropriated the word avatar. You know, where it's like the white guy can figure out the alien civilization better than the members of the civilization itself, right? And so I think that is an unfortunate old trope, which I would hope we could get past. And that's because that version of the story really erases black and female agency and turns the whole story into one of, well, abolitionist propaganda. So instead, I turned to contemporary women of color and the theory of intersectionality. Intersectionality has been developed over the last 50 years. I align it with the great African-American lesbian feminist Audre Lorde. And the idea is that at every moment you have to take into consideration how all of your multiple identities constitute you and how all of those multiple identities affect you in a world that is filled with inequality and prejudices. So, and I've given a partial list there of some of those identities, but intersectionality is really what the dialectic, whether you get that from Hegel or Marx or beyond, what the dialectic looks like when you actually take what people of color, and in particular women of color, say seriously. What it really means to look at life at the granular level of our differences. What makes the Canterbury story a particularly good example of intersectionality is that we have major players in the story from each of 4 large groups that were available to be fighting racism and slavery at that time. So black men, black women, white men, and white women, all of them were represented in this struggle. And what's more important is that they were all represented without being tokens. In almost every other abolitionist document that I know from this time, you have 70 white men and 2 black men. So there's just no way that the 2 black men are actually shaping the agenda or even contributing in a meaningful way. This story is different. You can't tell this story effectively or completely without involving all 4 of those major groups. Furthermore, there is differentiation by age with those 4 groups. Now, I don't expect you to recognize all these names. I will mention some of them as I go along. It would take away too much from the trajectory of the whole story to go over all of them right now. But suffice to say that a complete telling of the story would include them. So I'm arguing that this female academy in Canterbury was a highly significant event in American history. Now, I know that that's what every researcher does with their subject, but I think I can really make an argument that we have neglected a resource that could help get us out of some of the problems of our current time in terms of racial issues and gender issues and how they come together. And so in looking at Canterbury's Female Academy, it was created by a series of ripples that worked through those 4 groups that I outlined a moment ago. And then it helped to create ripples that came after it, after the school was closed due to violence. So I already mentioned Moses Brown as a predecessor. There was another great Quaker teacher, Anthony Benezet, and all my students know about Benezet because I tell them about Benezet. Benezet was a Quaker teacher at the time of the Revolution. He was a good friend of Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Paine, and other great Philadelphians of the time. He helped to found an anti-slavery society. He was one of the 2 men who made sure that the Quakers themselves would not have any slaveholders among them. And he was also a talented pedagogue. His primer for elementary school age students was used well into the 1850s, and not just by Quakers. So he was fairly talented in terms of understanding how children learn. He was also approached by some Black parents in the 1770s about whether he would be willing to educate their daughters in what was essentially the equivalent of a 1st grade class. And he said, sure, but let's not talk about it. He was obviously more prudent than Prudence Crandall. And after about 3 months, he went public and he said, here's what I have found out in teaching Black and white students together. There is absolutely no difference in the range of talents held by race. There are certain students who are better at one thing than another, but there's no difference that maps onto race. And he said anyone who thinks that the Blacks are less intelligent than the whites simply thinks that because they haven't actually had any contact with them in their lordly sense of superiority. So here's this great Quaker calling out white supremacy back when the country was getting started. So the next time someone brings up the bell curve to you, you just slap them with Benjamin Franklin's friend, Anthony Benezet. Benezet was a hero to a lot of African Americans, and in fact, when he died, his funeral was attended by almost an even number of Blacks and whites. And he left in his legacy a great deal of money to fund a Black school that educated many of the Black men who went on to support Crandall later. So, and then Phyllis Wheatley, of course, the great African American poet, her writings were republished in The Liberator, so they're getting around too. The first ripple was Black men knowing that they had to write and speak up so that their rights would be heard. And I'm speaking here of Black men in the North, not those who were enslaved in the South, but free Blacks in the North. And in this particular case, what happened was that there was a movement called colonization, which was the idea that Blacks should be sent back to Africa, which is kind of like saying that I should be sent back to the Netherlands, where I have never been. Right? I mean, it's dopey, it's cruel, it is purposely trying to get rid of those African Americans who are not slaves, right? But white America saw this as a solution to the race problem that they had been bequeathed by Jefferson. And so the colonization plan was backed by, among other prominent politicians, Francis Scott Key, and I really, really hope Colin Kaepernick knows that. And also James Monroe, who of course had the capital of Liberia, Monrovia, named after him, and the very well-named nephew of George Washington, Bull Rod Washington, was also the actual president of the Colonization Society. So it was almost a united front of white powerful men who were backing this idea. And so in Philadelphia in 1816, just as this idea was getting started, the African Americans called a community meeting and they said, no, we don't want this. This is not what we want at all. This is where we were born. This is where we grew up. We want to contribute to the United States. We want to stay right here. It was a beautiful protest. Their remonstrances were wonderfully well written. No white person paid the slightest sliver of attention to them. And so African American men figured out they were going to have to publish for themselves. and get the news out there and at least circulating among themselves. So by the mid-1820s, Samuel Cornish, who goes on to become one of Crandall's biggest supporters in the black community, he had put together the first African-American newspaper called Freedom's Journal, and that was supported by David Walker, a great agitator for African-American freedom at the end of the decade. And then in the most astounding moment in American history, a white man listened to a black man. I can't emphasize enough how rare this event was at that time. William Watkins was a minister and a black activist in Baltimore, and he was a friend of William Lloyd Garrison, who was a young and coming white abolitionist, but he was a white abolitionist who, like all white abolitionists, gave at least some support to colonization. Watkins said to him, no, you should have asked us. We don't want that. So that's 1829, when a white man listened to a black man and said, oh, I hadn't thought of it that way. You mean you don't want to do this plan? I mean, sort of like, I can consider this like when you give someone else a puppy without telling them. You know, it's like there's some times when you should check out if the gift you're giving is actually wanted. You know, and so again, black men were saying, no, we don't want to leave. So Watkins actually said to Garrison, no, it's not what we want. We want to stay here. And Garrison said, okay, you're right, I'm wrong. Publicly renounced colonizationism and went to immediate abolition and never broke from that position. And by the way, that Watkins, if you recognize the name, was the uncle and became the father when she was orphaned to Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, one of the great African-American writers of the second half of the 19th century. And then we get to 1831, the most important year in American history. I say that, and you are immediately searching your brain for what happened in 1831. And if you know your history, you know there was not a presidential election, you know there was not a war, and those are the markers we use. Presidential politics, assassination, war, we love those things because they're so easy to put a date to. But really, 1831 was great because it was the first time in American history when women and men, black and white, and in this case also, again, this is the part I'm having to leave out, Native as well, and immigrant as well, educated and non-educated, there's a whole class dimension too, but it's the first time they're all working together in the social political realm. And so each of the major groups that I have brought out was represented in these non-tokenistic way, and they also had intuited how to work together well enough that they understood what each group could do. The white men could be out front and take the publicity and deal with the publicity. Those black students who are going to go to Little Canterbury, Connecticut can't be out in the public eye. So they will be protected by those who can take the heat. So it's very interesting how they understood, again, in an intuitive movement work kind of way, what role each could effectively play. That's the year that Garrison started The Liberator. It's the year that he then published David Walker's incendiary appeal in the pages of The Liberator, which gave it a much wider audience. It was the year of Nat Turner's great slave revolt in Virginia, the closest that a slave revolt ever came to being successful here in the United States. Obviously, it was successful in Haiti, but in the United States. And Maria Stewart was a black woman whose writings were published in The Liberator in the immediate aftermath of Nat Turner's revolt. And Lydia Maria Child, who was, she's the one who wrote Going to Grandmother's on a Snowy Evening or some story like that that everyone's heard of. Anyway, I don't know about that because all I care about is she was the Martha Stewart of her day. And then she heard Garrison and she said, okay, I'm going to use my talents differently. I'm going to end this slavery thing. Became the first woman to get into the library at Harvard, dug up all kinds of things on the greatness of Africans and African Americans, and was disinvited to ever again go into the Harvard Library. But she gave up a lot of prominence and a lot of money to join the movement. And she's another person who could be a hero if we know how to actually count our heroes. So if you think about it, this is a big leap that was unprecedented, where we really had everybody in there, and that's because of the understanding that politics was not limited to voting. Yeah, voting is really important, so is flossing your teeth, but there's more to it than that. You know, you've got to get out there and actually make the change, put your ideas out, And we're seeing that right now with what the students from Parkland are doing, or what the climate activists in Europe are doing. They're teenagers, they're not voting yet, but they're trying to change the world. Okay. The third ripple was women's agency. Mariah Stewart's writings in The Liberator included a call to open a high school for Black women. She didn't have the resources to do it, she was a servant, but she said if we could pool our money and get a high school together, that might make a difference. So believing in education as a change agent. But because those were published in The Liberator, that meant that Black people in Boston were reading it, because The Liberator had become like a community paper for Blacks in Boston. Boston never had an independent Black newspaper. So there was a young woman named Mariah Davis who'd fallen in love with a Black man who lived in Canterbury, Connecticut, named Charles Harris. So she moved down to Canterbury, she needed a job, and she applied for the job of being a household helper at Crandall's place and Crandall's school. But she just moved down from Boston. She was reading this radical newspaper. And here she is, 18 years old, got her first job, and her employer is a white woman, and she starts vetting her employer. She notices that this Crandall person seems to have a heart and treats her better than most white employers treat their Black employees. So she starts bringing copies of The Liberator to the school. And Crandall starts reading them and starts to hear the actual truth. In other words, Black men and Black women telling what's actually going on. This entire school hinges on one brave Black working class woman. Yeah, and that's what's been erased. In fact, it's been erased so effectively that when I went to look for evidence, I became the first person associated with Crandall to find her grave. It's like even her grave had been neglected. She did end up marrying Charles Harris. They moved to a nearby town called Norwich. They opened a bar. I hope they had a good time, especially since other people were teetotalers who were associated with the school. So that might have caused some problems. But she ends up fairly anonymous, but she's a linchpin in changing perceptions. So that's, I think, a very special moment in understanding what we've been missing as historians when we look for the obvious stuff. We love printed resources, right? We love things that are in writing, but that's going to limit it to white men, a handful of Black men. We're not going to know about the working class Black woman. In this case, Crandall is always honest and says, I had a household helper who brought me the newspaper, and I was able to see what was happening. That's how we know. And even in her 60s, when she was being interviewed again, Crandall said, it fell in my way because of Mariah. So, very interesting. And in the meantime, William Harris, the father of that Charles Harris, who Mariah Davis is going to marry, he is the local Black agent for The Liberator. He comes from the Caribbean. So he knows all about slave revolts. He knows that change can happen. He came to the United States because he wanted to have a family and he wanted his children to get education. He became a very successful farmer. But he's the local agent for The Liberator, meaning that he's the guy selling it. So he gets it out to Mariah Davis. They have a complete copy of the whole run of The Liberator at their house. She can bring any issue she wants to Crandall. But Sarah Harris is also a daughter of William Harris, and she's also reading it. So now we have Crandall's school may have been inspired by a Black woman in Mariah Stewart's writings calling for a high school. Then it's triggered by the bravery of the Black women, Mariah Davis first to drop off those copies of The Liberator, and then Sarah Harris for daring to ask, can I be admitted? And by the way, Crandall let Davis sit in on classes, so she was also getting an education. And now we're going to have Black adults, both men and women, start to recruit the students for the school when it turns around. And then we'll see these other parts later, if I have time to get there. So this is what Sarah Harris said. I'm sorry, the only picture we have of Sarah is when she's much older. But she said, I want to get a little more learning, if possible, enough to teach colored children. And if you will admit me to your school, I shall forever be under the greatest obligation to you. To which she added, I know it might cause you trouble, so I'll understand if you say no. All right? But she kept coming back. When Crandall at first didn't respond, she kept coming back. We know this because what Crandall says is her repeated solicitations were more than my feelings could resist. So, said, and I told her if I was injured on her account, I could bear it. She might enter as one of my pupils. So this is a very important step for those of us who are white people trying to be anti-racist, is understand all of the pain that people of color have been bearing and say, hey, after all you've been through, I can handle this, right? I can take this on. I mean, you know, it's just a little bit of paying it forward. So Crandall had been brought to the abolitionist struggle by reading black writings and by talking to actual black women in her kitchen. Right? She wasn't brought over by the white men who were leading the movement at that time. But it's not because they were unimportant. William Lloyd Garrison she knew was the editor of the Liberator. So here's Prince Crandall, 30 years old, unmarried. She writes a letter to William Lloyd Garrison saying, hi, I'd like to talk to you about an idea I have. Could I see you? But the biographer of Garrison refers to it as a political tryst. You know, and so, yeah, they by the way, they met at a teetotaler hotel. And Garrison says, yes, there are enough free black families in the North that we could make a school viable for you. We'll make this work. So he gives her letters of introduction and sends her down to Providence. He was based in Boston. So now she goes down to Providence, where she meets with white men, two fellows by the name of Benson, George and William, who were brothers, and a black woman named Elizabeth Hammond, who was a widow running a respectable boarding house. And Elizabeth Hammond essentially walks her around the black neighborhoods of Providence, which had to be unusual at that time. And Crandall sees what's going on, and in fact, Elizabeth Hammond and she had such a good simpatico that it was Hammond's daughters who were the first students to arrive from out of state. And she then moves on to New York City, where it gets even more radical. Because here, it's not a woman contact she has, it's male contact through a black minister named William Miller, who then introduces her to all the black ministers of New York City, who were essentially the power brokers in the free black community there. 30-year-old white woman leaves town mysteriously and ends up meeting with black men in New York City. Not a story that's going to play well back home, yeah? But a remarkably brave thing for both Crandall to do, but also a smart thing for those ministers to do. If they're going to entrust the daughters of their best and most prominent parishioners to this woman, they too need to vet her. They need to make sure that this isn't just another white scheme that's going to collapse. Because there'd been such a collapse a few years ago. I'll show you that in a moment. So they're worried, they want to check her out, and they not only give her the okay, but the largest number of her students come from New York City. The black endorsers are an all-star cast of people who were around at that time, including some who were not ministers, like James Forten and Joseph Casey, who ran a perfume business, and apparently also ran the numbers, but that's another story. She gets back to New Haven, where she meets with some white abolitionists, Arthur Tappan, who was the wealthiest of the abolitionists, and also this fellow, Simeon Jocelyn. And Jocelyn is the one who had a failed school enterprise. He had tried to open a college for black men in New Haven, Connecticut. Simeon Jocelyn was super optimistic. He's like, New Haven's a great place. Everyone will love this idea. They didn't. They put it up to a vote. The school lost 700-4. That's not a good election. Now, I will add here that no black people could vote. No women could vote, but still 700-4 is pretty decisive. Yeah. So anyway, he ends up spending his whole life in abolitionist causes, and now his grave is not even kept up in good shape. It took me a long time to find that one. So I'm working with some folks at Yale to get that in better shape. So all of these endorsers sign this ad, which is the single most integrated document racially integrated document from the 19th century. 15 names, 8 of them are black, 7 of them are white, and you can't tell which are which. unless you know all the names. They're arranged by city, not by race. That is just as radical as the even division. The curriculum that's talked about is also fairly advanced, again, showing this to be at a kind of AP high school level or first year of junior college. And then the students start arriving, the most significant ripple of them all. We have very few pictures of these people. That has to do both with the invention of the camera, a lack of concern for Black resources and archives, all kinds of things. But here's the complete list. And when I was putting this show together, I looked back at some older PowerPoints I'd given where this list doesn't have to be in such small print. Because when I started this project, we only knew the names of about 18. And now through dogged research, and it's not all ones I found, other people have found some too, but we're up to 27, 28, depending on how you count them. And there might be more. The reason we don't know more names is because nobody kept roll, and that was done intentionally to protect the students. They never published. Whenever a writing by a student was published, no name was attached, just a student at the school, because they would have been harassed. They would have been driven out. Because the white supremacist forces in Connecticut put the students on trial 4 times, we have the names from the trials. That's where we get most of our names. Pretty sad. But anyway, if you know of any of these names, let me know. So one misconception about the students is that they were all little girls. They were not. They were teenagers. They were sexually mature. 15 and a half is the average age, which puts them at another vulnerable risk. Yeah? That they were merely learning to read, not true. Most of them had had an elementary school education. And that the school was a failure, well, me personally, I mean, I usually don't see a student more than 1 or 2 semesters. I don't consider that a failure, right? You judge education by its results, not by its longevity. I mean, yeah, I'm glad to teach at an institution that's been around for 150 years and so on, but it's the impact of education, not its length. The students went on, and we have here, their families were also tremendously supportive. The large woman there on the right, Mary Joseph Marshall Lyons, she was the sister of one of the students, J.C. Marshall, and their mother actually came up to Canterbury to help get a Black man off of a frame-up job that had been done to try to send him to jail. And it's one of the great stories of solidarity that I know. Sarah Harris's sister, Mary Harris Williams, also attended, and she went south at the end of the Civil War, moved to New Orleans, and was teaching the freedmen along with her husband. And they later have a family connection to Cab Calloway. So, you know, we could move into a whole nother part. And then there were the legal teams who had to defend these students. Great leaders, I won't go into that. And you know what? I'm gonna just delete the white supremacist. So the students the school was put on trial. A law was passed that made it illegal to house out-of-state Blacks for purposes of education. Apparently purposes of prostitution were fine, purposes of enslavement were fine, but education, that was right out. So this was a post facto law, of course, but still the school was tried on it. Crandall's legal team constructed arguments for Black citizenship that were so strong that the hideous Roger Taney actually attacked them in the Dred Scott decision, and then in Brown v. Board, they were resuscitated and endorsed. Okay, so her lawyers were the best that they could have had. But those students are the real heroes of these trials, even more than the lawyers. Think about it. Think about taking your high school class, right? Taking 4 teenagers and putting them on the stand when it's about their citizenship, their education, and they're amongst people who are persecuting them, and it's an all-male courtroom. They never flinched. They never made a mistake. We have the court transcripts. That's incredible. They got a hung jury the first time. The second time, there was a judge who had anti-Black sentiments who was going to decide against them no matter what they did. The third one was decided was the one about trying to get this Black man off the frame job, and that's where they really came through. He was acquitted within 15 minutes of the jury being given its orders. That's amazing, because it's, of course, an all-white jury. So these students came through, did everything they could, and they did that despite vigilante violence, despite the fact that a black cat was butchered and placed over the fence to show that black and white should never be together. It's the only known fatality. And the students responded with a theory of nonviolence that would have made Dr. King proud. So they're part of the great black tradition of nonviolence and passive resistance. When the school was eventually closed due to violence, by that time Crandall had made an unfortunate marriage. The less said about him, the better. But we can see here some of these students. Mary Elizabeth Miles married the great former slave, runaway slave, Henry Bibb. Julia Williams became the wife of Henry Highland Garnett, two of the greatest names in the antebellum black universe. Other students went on to become teachers and activists. One made a really good marriage and was so wealthy that they could hire Irish servants in New York. And they became internationally active and active across the United States. Another one of the students, Theodosia de Grasse, and you're like, wait a minute, that was a Hamilton reference. Yes. It turns out that Aaron Burr had adopted a sailor from India whose family was then classified as black when they came here, and in honor of Burr, they named one of their daughters Theodosia, and she attends the school. She marries a man named Peter Vogelsang, who becomes the oldest member of the Massachusetts 54th Regiment in the Civil War, the first black regiment. And even later, African Americans remember her and start a Prudence Crandall Literary Club in Chicago in the 1870s and 80s. Crandall finds out about that, and this woman, Fannie Barrier Williams, wonderful spokeswoman for black rights at the turn of the century, and kept that legacy alive. So all of this, as you can see, I'm going to come to an end here. There's more I could share, but like there's the whole story about Mark Twain, but you know. Because, yeah, everybody gets into the story. But you look at this, and I put all these little circles up here of people with whom she was connected. And what I came up with in terms of numbers is that there were, in the story, about 31 black women, including the students, about 6 to 10 white women, about 16 to 20 black men, and about 13 to 20 white men. In other words, the true integration of the story remains, no matter how you look at it. And so, yeah, what can I say? She was ill-named Prudence. But really, we shouldn't be all that surprised with the story of teenagers leading the way, of helping those who have privilege, in this case the white woman, to understand what were the needs of black women at that time, because we're seeing it again. And so I hope that you can take some heart from our four sisters and four brothers who sought to create the multiracial America in which we're now living. We haven't gotten it right yet, but it is still an experiment that I'm glad we are participating in. And we can let these other teenage activists right now, really nothing warmed my heart more than seeing how those students responded in Parkland to the crisis that had been foisted on them. And it just goes to show that maybe we do need, we need all those voices to show us the way out of our current morass. So thank you very much, and I'd be happy to take some questions.
Does anyone have any questions?
Where did the funding go for the teachers and the upkeep of the institution? Where did it come from?
At that time?
Yeah, from the churches, I would suppose.
There was one family that I didn't mention, a white family called the Burley family, that essentially their father was a former teacher, and he had been the head of a local institute. He had suffered a debilitating injury, but he had some funds, and so his kids were able to teach at the school for very little money. Crandall also hired her younger sister, Elmira, to help her out. Elmira was really a very feisty young woman, and so when the vigilantes threw a rock through the window, she said, "Oh, that'll look nice on the mantle," and kept it there. So the actual teaching was low. There were battles, though, in terms of cost. There were a lot of battles around who exactly owned that house. And, you can always tell a bad faith argument, which is that the white people, when they were trying to stop Crandall from having the school, said, and there you are in such a conspicuous place in the center of town. So Crandall's allies said, oh, well, she's happy to move a little bit further out in the country. And they said, no, we don't want it anywhere. Again, it was a bad faith argument, but they kept trying to pester her money-wise. And she ended up going into debt when the school had to close so precipitously. It's probably why she didn't open another school, that and the fact that she had married a snake. And so she ended up in debt to one of the other abolitionists, this fellow Samuel May. And as part payment, that's why she sold her portrait to him as partial payment. And the portrait had been done by a very famous portrait artist of the time. And so it was actually worth something. And so the story goes that in 1871, when Samuel May was dying, he was friends with the guy who was starting Cornell University. And he said, listen, I would like to donate all of my abolition papers, which was basically everything from the whole movement. I would donate all my abolition papers and the portrait of Prudence Crandall as long as you agree to admit women always and equally. So the portrait continued. What can I say? Crandall continued to do good work. But it was a long time before she had really paid back her debt to her ally. But it could have been a lot worse financially. There was also an attempt on the part of her enemies to cut her off from her parents, to fine her parents if they dared to visit her, because she was a scofflaw for operating the school. So, every dirty trick in the book got tried, but I've just decided after all this time, I don't like spending time on those people. I really prefer spending time with these students who are so amazing. And, and with what was happening that was changing the world. Yeah.
Thanks a lot. So going back to, you sort of alluded at the beginning that it was tough to find some threads, some of the threads. So how did you, what were your primary sources that pulled you into being able to elucidate so many of the participants?
The trial transcripts are one of the best sources we have. And of course, they're giving us the students' voices pretty directly, but usually filtered through what their enemies want them to be saying, and they still come out looking good, right? So that's a kind of double a kind of double check that historians go through. If you look strong even in your enemy's eyes, you were really good. Then we also know, because some people would talk about it later. They would mention that this was, that they had attended. Another way that we know is through obituaries, because sometimes someone wouldn't talk about it much, but it would get mentioned in their obituary. The strangest story this way, when I first came across the lists that had been assembled, there was one student who was just listed as M.E. Wiles, W-I-L-E-S. And, I was spending countless hours in various genealogical fora and looking at census records and all that kind of stuff. And we never could find a Wiles that had a daughter of the appropriate age in the North. Couldn't come up with it. And then another scholar, Afua Cooper, who has actually won for the best Afro-Canadian research in recent years, she found an obituary of Mary Elizabeth Miles that said that she had attended the school. And we're like, somebody just turned a W and an M into a W, because M.E. Miles. And then everything made sense, because Miles was a good friend to that Reverend May that I mentioned and had worked with him for many years after. She was a Quaker. She was from Providence. It all made sense. But just one transposed letter, and we weren't sure. So I think when Alpha Cooper brought it to us, she was like, do you think this is trustworthy? She said to those of us who were working at the museum. And then we're like, this solves a big mystery. Yeah. But it's really tough. And it doesn't help when someone, remember, women change their names often. both first and last. Like we have one student I still haven't located named Polly Freeman. Well, needless to say, Freeman was a pretty common last name among African Americans in the North, and Polly is clearly a nickname. It's probably not the birth name, right? And so I'm kind of like, it's just going to be a piece of dumb luck that's going to bring that one to us. But I didn't mention this. There was an elderly black woman in New York City, and I think I've identified who she is, but I can't say for sure, who had escaped from slavery and then done fairly well in New York City, and she actually paid for scholarships for some other students. And I would think that someone named Polly Freeman might have been a recipient. You know, but their family might not have been out that long. Yeah, sure.
Have you tracked down or talked to any of the descendants of the students who are living now?
Yes, yes, we have. And that's another amazing story. Descendants of the students include one of the first NFL black coaches and an athlete who participated in the Berlin Olympics and was on the same track team with Jesse Owens. Okay, so, you know, they're giving it to Hitler, right? Olympics. And another branch goes through a lot of music. That's the Mary Williams branch. But the most amazing story of all, oh, and there's also a branch that's now involved with Black history in Rhode Island, and they have a very good working relationship with the museum. But the most amazing story was a descendant who had been raised as white. The family was light-skinned enough that he passed. The whole family passed, and they'd moved to rural Wisconsin. And he was applying for his passport, and he went to he got his birth certificate, and it said black. And he said, oh, I'm sorry, there's a mistake here. And they said, no, there's no mistake here. Here's the family line. And he embraced it. He's like, okay, I'm going to find out. There was the family that had the Cab Calloway connection because his aunt had married Cab Calloway. And so he said, yeah, I remember Uncle Cab stopping by at the house, but we were just told that, you know, this was an interracial marriage. And so remarkable. He and his wife have both embraced this now and have really become big supporters of the school and of the kind of genealogical research that can turn these things up. And, you know, it could have gone so differently that it's just amazing that that in this case, the person who was found was ready to accept it, and also very ready to accept his parents' decision. He said, I understand they wanted me to do well. They didn't want me to have to fight all that prejudice. And he has done well in life. He's been an electrical engineer and had a good career. But he's like, you know, it's a different time, different place. So that's another thing I love about this particular moment, and why I use that ripples image, because the ripples that have come after are just as fascinating in some ways when you can trace it out, these moments in Black history that are touched on and in women's history. The first great historian of women's history, Eleanor Flexner, in the late 1950s, said that the Crandall School is one of the most important events for women's history. And then the 1960s branch picked that up with Gerda Lerner and then just let it drop. And so it hasn't been a part of the women's history narrative the way that it could be. By the way, it was part of the women's history narrative as far as Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony were concerned. They included her in their history of women's suffrage. Yeah.
Elizabeth Cady Stanton.
Yeah.
All right.